Hey folks, Matt Cuda here. I am actually on the road today for this installment of Reviews from the Blind. And I'm going to be reviewing the awesome Canon EOS 1DX Mark II. I was able to shoot with this all weekend. Let me first start by saying that I am a huge fan of the 1 series cameras. I've had 2 over the years. I've had the original 1D Mark II and the 1D Mark III. I love them. They're high quality. They have the best engineering in them, but they are kind of pricey. I thought I would start just by explaining, the build quality, go into kind of my general thoughts, and then just as we normally do, I'm going to go ahead and go over the specifications, look at some of the photographs that I made. I was able to do birds in flight this weekend. I was able to do static subjects. So lots of good stuff coming in this video. As I look at this camera, it looks exactly like every other 1 series camera that I've used. Feels good in the hand. I like the grip right here, very solid grip. Everything is at, the shutter release is in a very good position. The dial, of course, very good. If you turn it vertically, very good vertical grip. A lot of people, they look at these and they think, well, it's just such a big clunky camera. But if you really look at it, the camera itself is pretty much, from here up to here. The bottom part is really like a battery grip. It's built into the camera in this case. So it's really not that big of a thing. I actually find them very, very comfortable. I have fairly large hands. I mean, I guess regular size man hands. I don't know. Seems to be good for me. It does shoot at 14 frames a second. I'll let you hear what that sounds like. Yeah, that's a lot. And that does come in very handy. It doesn't just sound cool. It comes in handy. Doing my birds in flight this weekend, it really was good. Being able to have those extra frames per second. My primary camera, of course, is the Canon 7D Mark II, and it has 10 frames a second. So picking up those extra 4 is pretty amazing. You can get 16 frames a second with this camera if you use live view, but most of us are not going to do that for wildlife and sports. So what were the main takeaways from this weekend's shoot? What about this camera really stuck out with me? I think first and foremost, the autofocus. The autofocus system is just frankly amazing with this camera. It has the typical modes of the newer, if you are familiar with the 7D Mark II or the 1DX, those modes are still available. So I use the case 1 for most of my shooting. It seemed to be adequate. One thing I noticed with this particular body, though, is that when I was shooting the birds in flight particularly, I was able to lock on to birds that are very close and flying very fast. And that says a lot for this camera. My 7D Mark II is good, but not quite as good as this. No doubt about it. The next thing that I think really stuck out to me with this camera was the noise performance. I was able to shoot birds in flight at ISOs up to 20,000, believe it or not, and I could still in post get them usable. Now, I wouldn't make a huge print at ISO 20,000, but at 6,400, excellent quality. At 3,200 ISO, excellent quality. I'll be sharing those photos with you here in a minute. But just an amazing camera. Everything about it. I like the I like how they have the Q menu in the newer ones. I like the dual card slots. If we look in there, I can see the dual card slots in there. In this case, we have a CFast and a CF card. So that's welcome. Other than that, just if you're used to the 1 series cameras, or even if you're used to a 7 series or a 5D or a 7D, everything is going to feel pretty good to you. The only difference is with the 1 series controls is if you look at the top, you have these buttons up here that control your mode and your drive, AF, and all that. That's a little bit different than the 5D, 7D. It does have some fairly interesting modes here on drive. So let's see if I can bring this in here. It has silent high. So there are times where, and my 7D has this also, there are times when you're shooting kind of skittish wildlife where you need a quieter mirror and quieter shutter, and that's what this does. So I'm going to demo that real quick. So it's a little quieter. It doesn't take as many frames per second, but it's a little bit quieter. And then of course you can change that to the lower version. There's another setting there, and there's single. So definitely quieter. I think the birds would not be as alerted to that. Of course, 2-second timer, 10-second timer, very common. I used AI servo in all my testing. I use AI servo for almost everything. So that's not unusual for me. I didn't get a chance to really dig into all the features of this camera, but it does have pretty much everything you'd want. The other thing I wanted to mention is, one thing that really impressed me with this camera is the fact that it has a touchscreen autofocus when you're in video. And being able to do that I shot some 4K video this weekend as well. I'm going to show that to you, 3 of those, and the video quality is amazing. But more importantly, I can actually do pull focus and stuff like that with this touchscreen, which just blows my mind. Very cool, very cool. Other than that, you'll have to answer the question, is this worth the MSRP of $6,000? Obviously, it's going to be less than $6,000, but is it really worth the MSRP of that? I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. You'll have to answer that question yourself. Personally, if I were looking for a camera of this quality and so on, and I couldn't afford this camera, I would probably go with a used 1 series. The 1D Mark IV can be picked up for under $1,000 now, and the 1DX is up there. I think it might be around $2,000 right now, the 1DX. So you can definitely pick them up relatively inexpensive compared to their original prices, but it is what it is. It's a great camera, great results. I think you'll agree. So let's dig into the meat of this video. We're going to look at the specifications. Okay, let's look at the specifications for the 1DX Mark II. So first of all, this camera comes in at 14 frames per second, 21.2 megapixel sensor. Now, people ask, why a 21 megapixel sensor? There's probably 3 reasons for that. One, so you can attain the 14 frames per second. But secondly, so you can have a deeper buffer. And finally, so that you can have higher ISOs. Because remember, this is a sports and wildlife camera. And so we want those frames per second. We want the really high ISOs if needed. And so, and that deep buffer for flight shots particularly. And so that's why it's a little lower. Canon makes a 50 megapixel camera, but it has a lower frame rate, has higher noise. So that's why you see that in the more, Cadillac cameras that they produce. It's got 61 AF points, 41 of those being cross type. It's got a dual Digic 6 and a Digic 6 Plus processors. So that's pretty cool, right? Lots of processing power there, which again helps you for autofocus, a deeper buffer, and all that stuff is important. 4K video up to 60 FPS, 1080p video up to 120 frames per second. Again, great to have audio here in this model. I mean, video in this model at 4K. That's awesome. Autofocus is available at f8 on all autofocus points, and that's important because in the past, even in the 1 series cameras, it's typically your center point was always the only, or the one that you could use f8 at, but now all those are available. The Wi-Fi built in, GPS built in, ISO up to 409,600. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. It has an anti-flicker mechanism in there so that if you're in fluorescence, it will actually time itself with the flickering of the lights. AF points are now set up, are configurable. And so, in other words, the color is configurable. So you can have red as your color for your autofocus points. Before, that's a real problem. Like with my 7D and 7D Mark II, what happens is that those autofocus points, because they're a gray, a dark gray, or black, they blend in with dark backgrounds. And so that was a real problem for wildlife photographers. So that's been fixed. Touchscreen during video. Absolutely awesome. I love that feature. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Dual card slots, of course. All 1 series cameras have dual card slots. However, this one uses a CF and a CFast card. So both of them very fast cards, so I applaud them for that. Personally, I would like to see the dual card slots be both the same cards. I've never understood why Canon does that. They'll have, for example, in my 7D Mark II, I'll have a card slot for SD and a card slot for CF. I don't. That affects my speed. It affects my buffer. It affects the whole bus that writes to the cards is affected. So I don't know why both of them aren't CF in my 7D Mark II, and I don't know why both of them are not either CF or CFast. I don't know. That's always been irritating for me. This camera was released back in 2016, so a few years on her, but she's still holding her own. Let's talk about the autofocus of this camera, because I think that if I had to choose one thing, and if I could only pick one thing about this camera that I loved, it was the autofocus. The autofocus in this camera, frankly, just blew my mind. It was better than my 7D Mark II. I assume better than the 1DX, since that's kind of the autofocus system my 7D Mark II has. But what really blew my mind with this autofocus system is I put it through some pretty tough birds in flight scenarios. Falcons and owls flying close to my lens, high-speed birds, and it was able to track those subjects at a fairly close range, which I was just blown away by. So they've done something to this camera on the autofocus side that hasn't been available in previous models. So that's the big one. That's a big gun for me, and it should be for you as well. The autofocus system is a lot like any of the other autofocus systems I've used. It has the same case structure that the 1DX and the 7D Mark II have. So you've got case 1, case 2, case 3, case 4, case 5. Each one of those cases presents a different problem that it's trying to fix. I left mine on case 1. Case 1 is a multi-purpose setting, and for me it works for most scenarios. I mean, maybe I could have used one of the other settings here, but I just felt like case 1 does fine for me. I didn't have time, although I tested it for an entire weekend. I didn't have time to really dig into all these settings and change them. So I felt like that even on case 1, certainly it was effective with birds in flight, static subjects. We're going to see examples of these in a minute, but
just realize this is an amazing autofocus system. Let's talk a little bit about low light performance. Okay. I was in a very tough situation. I was at a photo shoot called Photo Wild here in North Carolina, and this time of year, it's in the fall, and it's very dark in the morning at 8 o'clock, extremely dark. And one of the reasons I wanted to test this camera was to see if it could handle that kind of low light situation. And I'm pleased to tell you that it did quite well. Could it have been better? Of course. You know, low light performance is one of these things that can always be better, right? But I thought it did amazing. I was able to use it at an 8,000 or ISO 8,000 without too much difficulty. Very usable shots. ISO 6400 for the static shots of owls and eagles and falcons and so forth. Really good, fairly clean, easy to clean up in post shots. But what really blew my mind the most is that I was able to shoot a shot of a falcon. Actually, no, the falcon was at ISO 8000, which was frankly amazing. But that I actually shot a shot of a Eurasian eagle owl at ISO 20,000. Now, granted, you know, I couldn't have made a, you know, massive print with this, but I'll tell you what, you know, for most uses like internet use and so forth, really amazing quality out of that camera, even at ISO 20,000. I don't recommend, you know, shooting at ISO 20,000 if you don't have to, but I mean, if you have to, it'll do it. You know, if I would have tried jacking my ISO up really high like that with my 7D Mark II, it would have been a complete snowstorm. I wouldn't have been able to salvage it at all. So that just speaks to the quality of the sensor. It's a full frame sensor, so, you know, again, amazing quality there. You know, image quality overall, very good with this camera. Certainly what you would expect from Canon's luxury line of bodies, the 1 Series line. I couldn't complain. It was very croppable, I guess is a way to say it. In other words, even after I cropped, I felt like the final product held good detail. Again, even though I was using higher ISOs that day, the images were good enough quality that I could clean them up well in post and still have usable photographs. The video, I was able to shoot 3 videos that day, or those 2 days. Video quality, very good, certainly. Certainly on par with, I guess, most DSLRs out there. But what I really liked on the video side of things was the touchscreen LCD, because I was able to just easily just touch the screen, touch the eye of the Raptor, and it literally would follow his eye around that screen and just keep it in focus constantly. Now, the disadvantage to that is when it's constantly using AI servo like that, and it's kind of, you can hear the motor on your audio zipping in and out, so that could be a problem for what you're doing. But I felt like serious upgrade for my 7D Mark II, which does not have the touchscreen. So I'm not a professional videographer. I have done it in the professional world, but I don't consider myself a professional videographer. I am more of a still photographer, but I did like it. You can do cool things like pull focus right there, and just amazing. So let's take a look at the photographs from that day. Basically where these pictures came from is my Flickr site. Let's go ahead and just look at these shots. So the first one I wanted to look at was this Lanner Falcon in flight. Now this shot was shot at f5.6 with my 150-600 at 252 millimeters, ISO 8000. So getting up there on the ISO, I was able to pull out that 12/50th of a second to get this shot. And yes, I did clean this up in post quite a bit because, there was obviously noise in the shadows quite a bit and just generally noise. But it was definitely usable. I could clean this up. I would have no problem selling this image, making prints of this image. Excellent autofocus and tracking to be able to capture this bird. So the next image I wanted to look at is a static shot of this great horned owl. And I mean, this isn't the most amazing image of a great horned owl, but what it does represent with this camera is the image quality. And you can just see it. Now, it just has a cleaner feel than my APS-C cameras. Now, honestly and truly, I can create almost as good a shot as this with my 7D Mark II, but I did feel like it was cleaner, and I was shooting at a fairly high ISO of 6400. And had I shot that with my 7D Mark II, it would have been quite a bit more difficult to pull that together in post. So again, just an amazing quality image produced by this camera. Okay, the next image I wanted to look at is another static shot of this eastern screech owl. And here he's got a piece of chicken, but again, a shot that certainly is a shot that's easily managed by this camera. This was shot at f6.3, 600 millimeters, 1/160th of a second at ISO 2500. Again, just had no problems with this camera, even at ISO 2500. Very clean, easy to maintain, easy to manage and post. Really a pleasure to shoot this camera. So, what are my conclusions? What are my concluding remarks on this camera? First of all, as I've already said, I'm a huge fan of the 1 series. Okay, I've been shooting 1 series for years and years now. They're high quality, no excuses kind of camera. If you can't get it right with this camera, then it's you, basically. So, it's a $6,000 camera, new. It's not for everyone. Okay, it's not priced for everyone, and so for that reason, if you're looking to have a good wildlife camera, but you can't afford that, I would really steer you toward the 7D Mark II, which you can easily pick up for under $1,000 used now. There's the 1DX that's out there. You can buy those used. The 1D Mark IV, still a good camera out there used, under $900 or under $1,000. But in the end, this camera is for the discerning pro or the discerning amateur that really wants a camera that is a no-nonsense, no-excuses camera. And that's just what this thing does. It's also, of course, used by sports photographers. And it has all the bells and whistles you'd want. It's fully weather-sealed. It's got the weight, the battery life, it's just a great camera. And I couldn't find a whole lot I didn't like about it. I honestly, I didn't. I couldn't find anything. For that reason, I have to recommend it. Frankly, it's a 5-star camera. I give it 5 out of 5 stars. I mean, certainly anybody would be happy to use it. Is it better than D5? I don't know. I've never shot the D5. I can tell you that the D5 has an amazing autofocus system. The D500 shares that autofocus system. I've been told it's better than this camera, but certainly, I would be happy to have this camera. It's actually a little heavier than some of the previous 1 series cameras, which is kind of odd, but it is there. Now, if you don't have a need for fast action, if you're a nature photographer that, you might do wildlife once in a while, but primarily you shoot landscapes and, you're a generalist in wildlife, I might steer you toward the 5D Mark IV in that case, or maybe even an older, 6D or 6D2, maybe even a 5DSR if you're a big landscape guy. But if you're into fast action, if you are a sports photographer, if you are wildlife, and that's your primary photography, you just can't do any better than a 1 series. And I would have that argument with anyone. As far as like things that people have reported with this camera, some have stated that this camera actually gets oil spots on the sensor. Canon has not acknowledged that this is happening, but I will say that there are pros out there that know what they're doing, and they do say it does happen. So that may be something you want to think about. Frankly, I can't wait for this camera to come down into the $1,000 range, because this may be my next body, to be honest with you. It's just an amazing piece of equipment. Anyway, that's all I had for this video. Thanks for watching. Make it a great day, and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye.